Thank you for that introduction. This is Elaine Lippmann, and I'll start the presentation by talking about the recent changes to the REMS statute, and then I'll turn it over to my colleague Laura Zendel, who will discuss some important considerations about the development of shared REMS programs. The learning objectives for this presentation are to examine the changes to the REMS statute through the Appropriations Act of 2020, to understand the implications of these changes for ANDA review and approval, to learn about FDA's approach to shared REMS following these changes, and to describe considerations during the development of shared system REMS. First, I'm going to start with some background. For purposes of this presentation, I'm going to assume that you all are familiar with REMS, what they are, and generally how they're used. If you want more background on that, the FDA website has a variety of presentations and guidance documents that can provide that. Instead, I'm going to start further along in the story with the entry of generics. Any generic product referencing a drug with a REMS is subject to these components of that REMS: the med guide, or PPI if there is one, and any elements to assure safe use, or ETASU. Now, the original statute required that the generic product use a single shared system REMS with the innovator for any ETASU. There are very meaningful, significant benefits of a single shared system for REMS with ETASU, which is undoubtedly why Congress included that provision. It reduces burden on the various stakeholders by providing a single set of materials and information about the program and a single access point. And stakeholders only have to enroll or obtain certification once rather than for each individual drug. It can also be beneficial for the drug sponsors because it provides an opportunity for cost sharing in developing and implementing the system. On the other hand, there are a lot of burdens associated with forming these systems. It's necessary for the companies to negotiate and establish agreements on many complex issues, such as voting rights, cost sharing, product liability, just to name a few. If the companies can make it through the negotiations over governance issues, they have to grapple with challenges in the development of the program itself. They have to figure out how to make the transition from a single REMS to a multi-source environment. This might mean deciding on new methods of verification of safe use conditions and possibly contracting with new distributors or maybe moving beyond specialty pharmacies. The backdrop of these negotiations is that the parties are marketplace competitors and often adversaries in patent litigation, so they may not have incentives that align with timely progress. Negotiations can sometimes involve a large number of companies if more than one ANDA has been filed. And finally, there are always uncertainties about the timeline in ANDA approval, having to do with other aspects of the application besides the REMS. So that's a little background about the complex arena of generics and shared system REMS. That brings us to the statutory changes that were passed with the Appropriations Act late last year. The first and most significant change is the removal of the requirement that an ANDA use a single shared system with the innovator, instead making that optional. So before, the law said that for the ETASU, the ANDA shall use a single shared system with the innovator unless FDA waives that requirement based on either of these two possible criteria. Under the new law, the ANDA may use a single shared system with the innovator or a different comparable program. So it removes the default of a single shared system and says you can do either without needing to seek a waiver. The new law does state, however, that FDA can still require the use of a single system if it determines that no different comparable aspect of the ETASU could satisfy the requirements. So now the default is that generics have an option, but FDA can affirmatively decide a single shared system is necessary. The new law also has a provision about subsequent generics that are filed after the first one is approved. If the first ANDA is approved with a separate REMS, FDA can require that the separate REMS for the generic be open to any other drug, either under 505J or 505B, that references the same listed drug. The purpose of this provision is to avoid the situation where we have more than 2 separate programs for the same drug. For situations where the generic is seeking approval with its own separate REMS instead of sharing with the innovator, the law includes a definition of what is a different comparable aspect of the ITASU. Different but comparable means that it may use different methods or operational means than the REMS for the innovator, but it must achieve the same level of safety. So it's generally okay for the separate REMS to go about things in a different way, as long as the end result that the REMS is designed for is achieved. The final change in the new law is to the section on REMS modifications required by the agency. Before, the law said FDA could require a REMS modification either to ensure the benefits of the drug outweigh its risks or to minimize the burden of complying with the program. The new law adds a third criteria that FDA can use to require modification to the innovator's REMS, and that is if a change is necessary to accommodate the existence of a separate REMS for a generic. So, for example, if the addition of a new separate REMS alongside the existing one necessitates some sort of communication between the programs in order to verify safe use conditions. That's just a hypothetical example. Now I'm going to talk a bit about the implications of these changes, particularly for generic applicants, although it obviously affects brand companies as well. The removal of the requirement that generics use a single shared system means that generics have a clear path to approval without depending on cooperation from the innovator. Generics now have the option of either submitting a single shared system REMS with the innovator or a separate REMS. Whichever REMS the generic company submits, FDA will review as part of the application. So unlike before, there is no need for a generic company to seek a waiver in order to use a separate program. A couple of important caveats to keep in mind, however. First, if the generic does submit a separate REMS, FDA must determine that the REMS is comparable to the existing REMS for the innovator. Second, the law does state that FDA can determine that no separate REMS could fulfill the requirements, in which case use of a single shared system will be required. So although a shared system is not always required now, there may be some circumstances where FDA determines a separate system would not be acceptable. Now I'd like to share some thoughts about FDA's approach to shared system REMS in light of these statutory changes. Although removing the requirement for a single shared system has benefits, we believe that shared system REMS are still ideal in most circumstances. As I explained previously, they offer numerous benefits to the stakeholders who interact with these programs, as well as potentially for the drug sponsors. Therefore, the agency is committed to actively facilitating the formation of these systems, and we're focusing on finding as many ways as possible to make that process easier and to make it successful whenever possible. To that end, FDA has taken several important steps. We reopened the comment period on our draft guidance on the development of shared system REMS. We also recently held a series of listening sessions with individual companies, both brand and generic, to talk about their experiences with developing and implementing shared REMS. We are currently synthesizing the feedback we received and are looking into ways we can improve the process for all the parties involved. We are also trying to formulate best practices that we can share with industry in order to help guide them through the process successfully. Before I turn the presentation over to Laura, I have a couple of challenge questions for you. The first is, if an ANDA applicant submits a proposal for a separate REMS, FDA will A, determine whether it should grant a waiver, B, make sure the separate REMS is not used by other companies. C, determine whether it is comparable to the innovator REMS. Or D, make sure it functions exactly the same as the innovator REMS. I'll give you a moment to think about that. And the answer is C, determine whether it is comparable to the innovator REMS. Okay, the second question is, which of the following statements is not true? A, FDA will not engage with sponsors about their REMS until approval. B, shared system REMS usually improve efficiencies for stakeholders. C, FDA can require a REMS modification to accommodate a separate system. Or D, FDA can require use of a single shared system if a separate one will not meet the necessary requirements. So which of these statements is not true? And the answer is A, that FDA will not engage with sponsors about their REMS until approval. And it's not true that we will not engage with you until approval. We intend to discuss the process and the progress and decisions with you as you go along and do what we can to facilitate the process. Now I am going to turn the presentation over to Laura Zendel in the Division of Risk Management to discuss some important considerations for development of shared system REMS.
Thanks, Elaine. Hi, I'm Laura Zendel with the Division of Risk Management, and I'm going to expand a bit on what Elaine discussed and how it fits into the development of shared system REMS. This is a simplified diagram of the steps in the formation of a shared system REMS. When a new ANDA that references an NDA with a REMS with elements to assure safe use is received for review, the Office of Generic Drugs issues a REMS notification letter to the ANDA applicant, letting them know of the requirement to establish a single shared system REMS with the reference listed drug or form a separate comparable system. CDER will initiate discussions with the ANDA applicants and NDA RLD application holder to encourage the formation of an industry working group, or IWG, for the single shared system REMS, and communicate the process and key milestones for the development of the single shared system REMS. CDER will also consider a proposal for a separate REMS if submitted by the ANDA applicants. If all goes well, the RLD and ANDA applicants will form an IWG, or the ANDAs may form their own IWG for their separate REMS. The IWG submits a proposed shared system REMS for review. CDER will review and act on the proposed shared system REMS. If the IWG is working to form a single shared system REMS, a REMS modification is required for the NDA RLD application holder, as well as a bifurcated REMS. We'll talk more about this a little bit later. As Elaine mentioned, when forming a shared system REMS, multiple companies need to work together. Typically, the companies will form an IWG to facilitate negotiations and agreements. This includes confidentiality agreements, voting structure, cost sharing, and decisions regarding which vendors to use. The IWG also establishes a single point of contact for communications between the agency and applicants for the REMS. Although there is an IWG helping to coordinate the REMS, when submitting the REMS proposal for the shared system, each applicant needs to submit the REMS to their own application. The reviewer looks at all of the applications while they are under review, so it's helpful when they all come in on time, within a day or so of each other, and that they all look the same. Sometimes we run into situations where, for example, one applicant added a table of contents, or there is some small formatting differences in the different applications. These small changes make the review of the shared program more challenging, so it's important to coordinate and make sure that everyone is submitting the same thing around the same time. If the IWG has questions along the way, we are available to answer them through email, through the Office of Surveillance and Epidemiology Project Manager. For concerns that may require a dialogue, we can also set up a meeting via teleconference. To help simplify shared system REMS submission and review, a Type 5 Drug Master File, or DMF, can be used. A DMF is a submission to the FDA that may be used to provide detailed information about facilities, processes, or articles used in the manufacturing, processing, packaging, and storing of one or more human drugs. There are many types of DMFs, and the Type 5 DMF can be used specifically for REMS. While the use of a DMF is optional for REMS, we recommend that the applicants use one for shared system REMS. The use of a DMF improves efficiency of the submission and review process for shared systems, as there only needs to be one submission to the DMF for all applicants authorized to reference it, and that means there is only one submission for the agency to review. The owner of the DMF is jointly designated by the shared system applicants and makes the shared system REMS submission on behalf of the group. We understand that when converting to a single shared system REMS or forming a separate REMS, that it might not be identical to the innovator REMS. In thinking about development of the shared REMS, the applicants need to figure out how the REMS will work with multiple products and manufacturers. While the shared REMS has the same elements as the innovator REMS, it does not need to be identical. Depending on what works best for the applicants, operational changes such as transitioning activities from the pharmacy setting to the REMS coordinating center or adding additional functions to the program may be necessary to accommodate multiple manufacturers or improve upon the existing system. The IWG may also need to negotiate with new vendors or distributors when developing the new program. Other reasons for differences in the shared REMS space include accommodations for patents or exclusivities. What the agency is looking for is that the shared REMS is a complete and thought-out program, and that it is comparable in that it achieves the same level of safety as the innovator REMS. Some special consideration needs to be taken into account to reduce burden when a separate REMS is going to be implemented, especially if there are restricted elements like required certifications or reporting of safe use conditions. We haven't had many of these programs yet, but what we've learned so far is that they are inherently more burdensome and confusing for stakeholders than single shared systems. Some sources of burden include that stakeholders may need to enroll in both programs. They may potentially need to report safe use conditions to both programs, and pharmacies may need to confirm that the patient or prescriber are enrolled or certified in the REMS that corresponds to the product that they are dispensing. There can be added complications if stakeholders are only enrolled in one of the programs. For example, there can be uncertainty about what a pharmacy should do if a patient is enrolled in one program and needs to be dispensed drug from the other program. This can get very messy very quickly. When developing the separate REMS, consider options to establish communication between the separate REMS and the innovator REMS to help reduce burden and confusion for stakeholders. One option could be to develop a shared database with the innovator REMS so that all of stakeholder information is housed in one database that both programs can access. Another option could be the use of open communication between the programs, where the programs are able to talk to each other to confirm stakeholder enrollment or safe use conditions while still maintaining separate databases. If establishing open communication is a necessary requirement of the separate REMS, FDA can require a modification to the innovator REMS to accommodate this. We encourage you to think of other innovative ways to incorporate communication between programs to reduce burden and confusion, and lay out the proposed process clearly in the REMS proposal. Launching the new shared REMS is often the most confusing time for the stakeholders involved. The shared REMS should have a plan for notifying stakeholders of the pending changes to the REMS and the availability of the new program. The transition plan should be detailed and include a time frame for when the new REMS will be operational and when and how stakeholders are transitioned to the new program. If a stakeholder needs to enroll or re-enroll, a detailed plan for education and support should be outlined and implemented. The transition plan should be included within the supporting document. When developing the shared system REMS, we are never 100% sure if an ANDA will receive a full approval, tentative approval, or a complete response. There are a lot of other moving parts going on with the ANDA application that change the status, and it may fluctuate throughout the REMS development phase. The ANDA cannot be approved with either a full approval or a tentative approval without an approvable REMS. Therefore, we approach the review of the REMS as if the ANDA is otherwise approvable to assist the IWG in the development of the REMS. This brings us back to the bifurcated REMS for the reference listed drug or a single shared system REMS. A bifurcated REMS will be requested from the RLD holder to account for the possibility of tentative approval of the first ANDA. The bifurcated REMS consists of one continuous document starting with the bifurcated REMS document, followed by the appended materials for the RLD REMS, and finally the appended materials for the shared system. The bifurcated REMS document is divided into two parts. Part A of the REMS document is equivalent to the existing REMS and applies to the RLD while the ANDA is tentatively approved. Part B consists of the approved shared system REMS document that applies once the first ANDA receives full approval. The RLD needs to submit their shared system REMS as bifurcated, while the ANDA applicants only need to submit the shared REMS portion. In conclusion, the development of shared system REMS, whether they are with the RLD or separate, is complicated with many moving parts. The agency is committed to actively facilitating the formation of these systems, and we welcome your feedback as we gain more experience in the shared system REMS space and find ways to make this process easier and successful for the sponsors, as well as the stakeholders who interact with these programs. Let's move on to some challenge questions. Challenge question number 3. Which of the following statements is not true? A. The IWG establishes a single point of contact for communication with the FDA. B. Single shared system REMS proposals only need to be submitted to the NDA. C. Changes to the operations of the shared system REMS are okay if it achieves the same level of safety. D. A transition plan should be included with the proposed single shared system REMS. The answer is B. The REMS proposal needs to be submitted to each application. Challenge question number 4. A bifurcated REMS accounts for A. Creation of a separate REMS, B. Changes in operations of a single shared system REMS, C. Full approval of an ANDA, D. Tentative approval of an ANDA. The answer is D. A bifurcated REMS accounts for tentative approval of an ANDA. In summary, generics can submit either a single shared system REMS or a separate REMS. Changes to the shared REMS are okay as long as it achieves the same level of safety. Lastly, single shared systems are ideal in most circumstances as they offer numerous benefits to stakeholders who interact with these programs as well as potentially for the sponsors. Here are some resources that may be helpful when thinking about developing shared system REMS. Thank you so much for your time, and what questions do you have for us?
Thank you so much, Laura, for that presentation, and thank you to Elaine, who is joining us now to take some questions. You guys did a great job of explaining so many complicated things, so I'm sure our audience appreciates it. And as for the audience, if you guys can go ahead and put your questions into the question pod at the lower right, we're going to go ahead and try to get to as many of your questions as we can. And with that, we're going to go ahead and start out with a question for Elaine. Would you say biosimilars are expected to participate in shared REMS programs?
Hi, everyone. Yes, although it may not be required, it is strongly recommended, basically because the same potential for stakeholder confusion exists if there are separate programs for biologics and biosimilars as drugs. So the same interest exists in having a shared system. Obviously, if that's not possible, then we'll work with sponsors, but it is definitely encouraged.
Great, thank you, Elaine. And our next question is also for you. What is FDA's stance on sponsor-proposed shared REMS programs? For example, can sponsor groups develop and propose a shared or class REMS to FDA?
And the answer is yes, absolutely. If sponsors believe that they have a good proposal for bringing programs together and having a shared system, we are very interested in hearing that proposal and reviewing it. So you can go ahead and submit that proposal or even get on the phone with FDA and discuss it, and we will be happy to work with sponsors on refining that and making sure it's successful.
Wonderful, wonderful, thank you. Also for Elaine, can you clarify the use of packaging in REMS? Is this considered an ETASU or a separate and distinct part of REMS?
So the packaging provision is considered totally separate from the ETASU elements. It's used in very different and specific circumstances. So all of the shared system issues that I've been talking about are really not applicable there. It's a very different statutory provision.
Okay, great. And thank you, Elaine. We'll do a couple questions for Laura, and then we have more questions for Elaine. And reminder, please just go ahead and put your questions into the chat pod, and hopefully we'll get to them today. So for Laura, does the RLD always need to submit bifurcated REMS when a shared system REMS is pending?
Hi, thank you for that question. Yes, we do typically ask the RLD to submit a bifurcated REMS with the shared system proposal, and that is, again, to account for a situation in which there's a tentative approval of the ANDA. So when that happens, the ANDA is not approved fully, and then the original innovator REMS will remain in place until the ANDA receives full approval.
All right, great. And another question for you, Laura. What aspect within the submission have you seen ANDA sponsors needing to improve the most?
One aspect with submissions in general from ANDAs is that they sometimes are missing documents, or they're not 100% the same as what was submitted in all of the applications. So sometimes we'll see slight differences in the actual submissions, which makes reviewing the entire shared system a little bit more challenging. Also, they sometimes don't all come in at the same time, so that again makes it a little bit challenging. In terms of the REMS proposals, I think one of the things that could be improved are having a fully fleshed out REMS operations, especially within the supporting document. A lot of times that is not fully fleshed out, and we have a lot of back and forth because of that. So those are two things that ANDA sponsors could improve.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much. And our next question is for Elaine and Laura. But who wants to respond, or both respond, but what is the timeline Question is, what is the timeline for review and negotiation of shared REMS proposals to FDA?
Laura, do you want to take that one, or shall I?
I can take that one. So as the timeline for reviewing the single shared systems or shared system REMS, there's not as specific of a timeline as there is for developing a REMS for just a brand name product, but we try to align the approval of the REMS with the approval of the first ANDA. So it's kind of dependent on when the ANDA is going to be ready for either a full approval or a tentative approval.
Great. Thank you, Laura, for taking that. And this one's going to go back to Elaine. Given stakeholder confusion over PS ampersand REMS, is the agency rethinking allowing 2 different generic REMS programs?
And pardon the interruption, it seems that we're having just a bit of problem with Elaine's audio. Elaine, we're seeing your microphone icon, but we're not hearing anything. We're going to try to work that out on our end. If you want to go ahead and remute. And if we can, Lisa, if you have another question for Laura, we'll try to figure out what happened to Elaine's audio.
Great, sure. Our question is for Laura. Are there any bifurcated REMS approved on REMS at FDA that the audience can go ahead and look at and kind of peruse? And that question is for Laura. I can go ahead and repeat it, Laura. So are there bifurcated REMS approved on the REMS at FDA that we as the audience can go ahead and look at and look at?
Hi, sorry about that. I don't think that there are any actual bifurcated REMS on the website, but essentially what it is the innovator REMS with a bifurcated REMS document, and what that looks like is the innovator REMS document followed by the shared system REMS document, and then it's all of the innovator REMS materials followed by all of the shared system REMS materials in one document. So again, I don't think that there's any on the website, but when putting together the REMS, we are happy to help out the sponsor with creating the bifurcated REMS and giving directions on how exactly to do that.
Great, thank you so much, Laura. All right, we're going to go ahead and retry our earlier on and see if Elaine, can we go ahead and...
Okay, can you guys hear me?
Oh yeah, we can hear you great, thank you.
Okay,
all right,
I'm sorry about that. You can still hear me? I'm hearing you, but you got me? Okay. So we were talking about ampersand, and this was a situation where we approved 2 separate REMS for that product, and then after approval of the generic, we brought in the sponsors and they merged their programs into one. And it is a great example of the potential challenges of having separate REMS programs, and it highlights why SBA generally prefers having a single shared system. However, I will say that each program is different, and some may be more likely to lead to stakeholder confusion than others. And likewise, some programs might be more conducive to running in parallel than others. It really depends on the program, what the requirements are, and how they are operationalized. So unfortunately, it's difficult to say one way or the other what we would do in a given circumstance. It's going to have to be somewhat case by case. But again, the safest thing, of course, in terms of preventing stakeholder confusion is to have one program, if at all possible.
Great, thank you, Elaine. And Laura, if you want to see if there's another question that you think you'd like to answer, you want to take a look at the questions coming in. But this next question will be for Elaine. Now that waiver-granted REMS is now replaced with a comparable REMS, what is the plan to address waiver-granted REMS that are currently under review and not yet approved?
So if there's an application in-house with a waiver request, we will go ahead and review the submission for the separate REMS. In other words, we'll review that REMS proposal and see if it is comparable and meets the statutory requirements. What we will not have to do is review the waiver request, and we will not have to do an analysis of whether the previous statutory criteria for a waiver have been met. So that piece is no longer necessary, but we still do have to determine that the separate REMS is comparable and that it achieves the same level of safety.
Very good. And a question for Elaine. Would the prefix PS be retained for any separate system in the future, like PS ampersand?
Yeah, so the PS that we put on the separate program for ampersand was our way of trying to find a way to easily differentiate one program from another when we do have parallel separate programs. So we worked hard to figure out what exactly the right letters would be. We settled on PS, which stands for parallel system. And again, it's just sort of a way to differentiate them at first glance. We do think that we would probably keep using that. Obviously, if folks have feedback about that, we are interested in hearing that, but we are planning to try to use that in the future.
Okay, great. And we have another question that came in. Can you speak to, and this could be for Laura also, or Elaine, can you speak to what the challenges have been of having two different programs?
Hi again. There were a lot of challenges, especially for the pharmacies. I think those were the stakeholders that had the most confusion with having two programs, especially because it was hard to implement that, and a lot of them either had to be certified in both programs or were confused as to what to do if a patient was enrolled in one program that was different from the program that the pharmacy was certified in. So there was a lot of confusion with having both programs. We got a lot of inquiries about it. So yeah, I would say it's mostly on the pharmacy end and confusion over what to do in terms of enrolling in one program or both programs, and what to do when patients were enrolled in a different program from the pharmacy.
Great, thank you for that explanation. Very good. Helpful to learn more. And we have another question for Elaine. If a single shared system is applied, Would it be mandatory for all companies to follow, or will separate REMS still be accepted?
Okay, so I think what I'm understanding that question to be is if we have a single shared system, so a generic has come online and we approve a single shared system with the innovator and that generic, if another generic comes in, would we be open to a separate REMS, or would we require them to join the single shared system? So if I'm understanding that question correctly, we would very strongly urge the future generic applicants to join that existing single shared system. The fact that we approved one suggests that it is possible to form that system, to work together, and we would strongly encourage and do everything we could to facilitate joining that system. That said, if there were some legitimate reason why it would not be possible for that generic to use the single shared system, we would be open to considering a proposal for a separate REMS.
Great, thank you. And this is going to be our last question of the day, and it's going to go to Elaine. So is the agency expecting the currently approved waiver-granted REMS to be converted to comparable REMS at some point in the future?
The requirement that a separate REMS be comparable to the innovator REMS existed before, when we needed to grant a waiver, as well as now under the new regime. In both cases, we would not approve a separate REMS unless it was comparable, and the same definition of comparable applied as well. So it needed to have the same elements to assure safe use and achieve the same level of safety. So any REMS that has been approved with a waiver should already have a comparable REMS, and so no conversion would be needed.
All right, thank you so much, Elaine, and thank you to Laura for your presentations and again answering so many questions so thoroughly.